Well, good afternoon, everyone. It is such a pleasure to be with you again. You have no idea how I look forward to these moments and to continue my account of my adventures of living and working in Europe in the early 1960s. I believe most of you have followed these readings and know that I spent the month of October in 1963 on the Greek island of Paros and then drove across Greece and Italy to Rome in the hopes, barely an American college graduate with newly married, of finding a job in Italian cinema. That was my dream. I did have my BA after all. And somehow it actually happened. So today's chapter opens when I am already 2 years into the experience of being an interpreter and translator in the press office of a company called La Ceiad Columbia, which was an Italian film distribution network that Columbia Pictures bought in order to distribute their films to the Italian peninsula. Rather than creating a whole bunch of new offices, they just bought this one company. Um, my boss, quite surprisingly, was a Swiss Italian woman. Her dad was Swiss, her mom was Italian. Her name was Maud Muller. Did not have executive positions in Rome in 1963. Um, and she had her assistant was a typical Roman guy with a cigarette hanging out of his mouth and ash on his lapel and so forth, named Manfredo Verdini, who became a really good friend. He was lovely, took good care of me. And they had a secretary who was about as round as she was tall, and she just fluttered all over Maud and took great care of her, including her little dog, Penny, who was a toy black poodle who came with her every day and walked very proudly into the office, slept under her desk till lunchtime, went home with her, came back in the afternoon, so forth. So those are the people that you'll hear for about every so often in this reading. So without further let me say that if you have any questions or you want to interrupt or you want to throw a tomato, whatever, great, please. So this is chapter 5. It's called Warren Beatty and the Venice Film Festival, 1965. My room on the top floor of the very elegant, Hotel Excelsior on the strip of land known as the Lido di Venezia was slightly larger than a closet. There was one small window under the slanting dormer that looked back across the lagoon to the charmed city itself. Inexpensive, and thus in line with my boss Maud's budget, my accommodations were just fine with me, as after the festival screenings and much wine, I was only in my room to sleep. Well into my second year of life in Rome, my spoken Italian was essentially fluid, so that I could honorably serve as interpreter for the Italian film critics and journalists stalking the glamorous hotel corridors for stars and stories, as well as, back in Rome, translating the American films simultaneously after they arrived from the US. This was much to the pleasure of my colleagues and customs official who, officially, remained in the screening room to confirm that the silver canisters arriving at the Fiumicino airport from Los Angeles actually contained the motion pictures as indicated and not some contraband import. Cigarettes, cocaine, whatever. As noted earlier, Italians loved American movies, which were dubbed using the same voice for each star, no matter which studio made the film. So it made it very easy for Italians immediately to recognize, because the voice was always the same. That's Elizabeth Taylor, that's Burt Lancaster, as they called him. Boom, it was great. So along with the Beatles song, She's Got a Ticket to Ride, at the top of the chart, 1965 was the year that the director Arthur Penn, rightly famous for his subsequent masterpiece, Bonnie and Clyde, brought a Jean-Luc Godard-inspired film entitled Mickey 1 to the Lido. Starring the super handsome rising young star Warren Beatty, The film earned a nomination for a Golden Lion Award. However, neither the critics nor its star, nor me for that matter, really understood what Penn was trying to say with its nouvelle vague psycho-philosophical film noir. It's sort of, it's a very interesting film, I guess. As I remember it, the most engaging scene was Beatty standing alone on a stage, squinting into the darkness through blinding footlights, where a mafioso hitman might be waiting to gun him down. My first sight of the actor himself was his entrance into the Excelsior's glittering main dining room, quote, as if he were walking onto a yacht, as Carly Simon would write and sing years later. Maud, Manfredo, and I were already seated with Penn and his pretty wife Margaret, who stood up to meet Beatty, tall, handsome, already a leading man, accepting from him a kiss that called to mind, for me, a scene from James Joyce's Ulysses, when Molly Bloom, who was also a singer, meets her manager and brazen lover, Blazes Boylan. Over the subsequent decades, the stories and rumors swirling around Beatty have been worthy of Joycean description, like making love while simultaneously making a phone call with one of the very famous conquests that included Diane Keaton, Carly Simon, even Jackie O. That evening on the Lido, however, he was a warm and gracious dinner companion, chatting amiably with his director and the rest of us around the table. Following the dinner and the showing of the film, Maud had arranged for Beatty to be interviewed by Edgarda Ferri, a wonderful Italian journalist, long dark hair, deep eyes, alto voice. I had a bit of a crush on her. But she was a journalist with the Italian magazine Gente, which was a large format publication like our long lost Look and Life. Having finished our espressi and tiramisu, Beatty, Ms. Ferry, and I trooped off to find a quiet corner in the hotel for the interview. Beatty easily dazzled Edgarda as she was dazzled by him, and the resulting two-page article with photos of the smiling actor turned out to be everything the folks at Columbia in Hollywood and New York could have ever hoped for. Even I had an unexpected setting the scene mention in the article. Quote, un giovane tizio americano di nome Jimmy faceva da interprete. A young American dude named Jimmy served as interpreter. They loved Jimmy, which they spelled Gimmi, and they said it with the accent on the first syllable. Jimmy, Jimmy, vieni qua, come here. Vieni qua, adesso, now. They were great. By then, interview completed, it was late in the evening. Thanks, hugs, and kisses exchanged, we had turned to go our separate ways when Beatty put his hand on my shoulder and asked if I would like to join him in his suite to talk for a while. Surprised? Yes, and more than a little bit intimidated. But once suited in his spacious suite, with its beautifully furnished living room, itself 10 times the size of my little nook under the roof, lit by a beautiful Murano glass chandelier that sent rich colors into the corners of the velvet couches. My spirits were calmed by the large platter of antipasti, dark, sparkling Lambrusco wine, and bottles of San Pellegrino, decades before it was familiar to Americans, that arrived on a rolling cart, which I gladly accepted from a young Excelsior server. It might as well have been the stateroom of a yacht in which I found myself. Beatty's voice could be heard on the phone from the bedroom, the first of many calls during the hour of our conversation to his then-girlfriend, Leslie Charon, in Paris. The 600-plus telephone tab, the equivalent of 3 months of my salary, sent my boss, Maud, staring at this charge attached to her budget in her office in Rome, sent her around the bend for days. My nerves in the moment, however, much calmed, I relaxed and enjoyed the translucent prosciutto, sliced salami, chunks of parmesan, and bubbly lambrusco. Nice thing about Italy, you don't starve. The actor returned with a smile between calls each time. Our subsequent sequential conversations were, not surprisingly, a single long Beatty monologue. At the core of his lament, actors had no power in the studio system of Hollywood. Even world renowned stars were just hired hands and often abused personally and professionally. This insight about Hollywood was of actually very long standing and impossible to overcome, against which even the astonishing screen goddess and digital innovator Hedy Lamarr struggled unsuccessfully during her long and storied career. She actually figured out an electronic thing about digital transmission that makes the iPhones possible. It's like, and she was gorgeous. Over the past half a century, Beatty actually has succeeded brilliantly in following his own advice, as have an increasing number of actors of both sexes becoming producers, directors, as well as stars, and managing their own careers in the cinema of the 21st century, with their motion pictures and television series streamed to giant digital screens in our living rooms. As we were wrapping up, Beatty looked at me and launched into what turned out to be the most unexpected job interview of my career. Thus it began, Beatty. How did you avoid the draft? The conflict in Vietnam in 1965 was heating up, as you will remember. I'm married. Married? He was surprised, but that didn't seem to be a deal breaker. How old are you? I'm 23. Can you type? Type? Yes, I can type. And what do they pay you? In dollars, about 260, 275 a month. I can pay you 4 times that. He stopped to study my reaction. What would I do? It was hard not to be intrigued. You know, work with me, help me do stuff. My mind raced through the vagueness for something to hold on to. Could I still live in Rome? No. You can live in LA, New York, or London. Doesn't matter. But not Rome. Nothing's happening in Rome. He stood up, asking, "What's your phone number?" Which I gave to him. "I'll call you at the beginning of next week, okay?" Yes. And thanks so much for the okay, good night. He was already heading back to the phone, and yet another expensive call to the deliciously long-legged Ms. Charon as the door to his suite closed behind him. Yeah, exactly. I didn't even know how to think about this turn of events. An undefined job with a Hollywood movie star living in LA, New York, or London. The whirlwind of thoughts finally subsided and brought me sleep in my little chambre under the eaves. And Beatty's offer wove itself obsessively in my thoughts during the last days of the festival, stopped in their tracks only by a chance smile from what I believe was the beautiful Monica Vitti, before she, leaving the hotel, turned and then stepped into a waiting black Cadillac limousine. Ultimately, the issues were pretty clear. Were I truly interested in a career in the movie industry, this would certainly have been an opening. Plus, there was the money. But it was the question of where we would live that remained foremost among my considerations. The prospect, however, of living in the other 3 fabulous localities notwithstanding. Rome was simply magical, and my Italian had become smooth and confident to the point that new acquaintances refused to believe I wasn't a native. In some cases, they seem mildly insulted by my insistence on being an American, as if I were just putting them on. The resolution came thanks to my having studied French in high school, an unexpected consequence of which caused my pronunciation in Italian to be slightly accented in the same way Italian is spoken in the northern city of Torino, a region that alternated between French and Italian domination over the long centuries of history, depending on whose political and military power was then in ascendance. Therefore, it turned out that my name is easily translatable, and to avoid social misunderstandings, I took to introducing myself as Giacomo James Chiaromonte Lichtenberg, i.e., Mountain of Light, Chiaromonte. Da Torino, of course, from Turin. Much to the ongoing amusement of Manfredo and journalist friends who might have been in the office at the time, who were delighted to go along with this pretense. Giacomo Chiaromonte, give me a break. Return to Rome the following week began with the familiar rituals at the Chayad office, when we went to the bar in the morning, when we went home for lunch, when we came back at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, etc. And sure enough, the following evening, the phone rang in the top floor, one-bedroom apartment where we lived on a street called the Via Squarcialupo, which means a piece of the wolf, go figure, near Piazza Bologna, which means Bologna. Beatty and I exchanged quick pleasantries, and he confidently asked where I wanted to live. I told him no. At first, he didn't understand. He seemed stunned. I stumbled through an awkward explanation of how important it was for me to continue the Roman experience, and he hung up. Was mine the right answer? I certainly have worried the question often enough in subsequent years. At some point, I read a review of a book by a young man who had accepted a position similar to that which Beatty had offered me. Obviously, the book's author wasn't me, nor I him, but given the brilliant and successful actor, director, producer, overwhelming intensity, it didn't sound as though the young man had had a whole lot of fun. Happily, life had other things in store for me. The last time I saw Warren in person was by sheer chance early one evening a few years later at the trendy New York City rock music emporium and Warhol crowd hangout called Max's Kansas City, which eventually, with the gentrification of Park Avenue South, became one of the many Korean produce markets that suddenly bloomed throughout the metropolis. Beatty was sitting all alone, intent on soaking up the scene. I think he may have been started to go out with Madonna, and so you had to know something about rock and roll. Anyway, there he was, all shiny. He looked out of place and uncomfortable in this famous New York artist's dive bar. Having myself become, by that time, a member of a lunatic fringe of rising New York rock music critics, Frank Zappa, a rock artist, called us people who can't write, writing for people who don't read. That was a rock critic. And more on that next time when you're here, hopefully. With octagonal glasses, long hair down to here, dark clothing as required of all serious New York writers, if not exactly a Warhol insider, I was down with that scene. And all things considered, Warren probably would not have welcomed an attempt on my part at renewing the acquaintance. Thus, our two roads diverged for the second time and final time in this darkly lit club. My encounters with John and Yoko, Jerry Garcia, Stephen Stills, Boz Scaggs, Dwayne Altman, and writing for the underground press, East Village Other, and then for Q Magazine, which was I convinced the editor to write about artists as well as all the plays and stuff in New York. And finally, the New York Times, these were all unfolding for me. So that is, as the poet wrote, that has, as the poet wrote, made all the difference. Thank you. So if you have any questions or concerns. What? Well, first of all, I wasn't sure. I have since thought about it, and I could imagine going up to him and saying, "Hey, Warren, do you remember me? I was that rude young man who didn't understand what a fabulous gift you were about to give me in Rome. However, I now know a lot about this brand new scene, this rock music scene. I'm writing for the New York Times, blah blah blah. Um, maybe I can be useful to you in that regard. Is there any way I could make up for my incredible gaffe of not, becoming one of your proteges?" But it, well, what I thought might happen was that I would introduce him. He would tell me the kind of things he had in mind, and I would say, "Well, such and such a rock group actually is writing about issues like that, and maybe there's a way I could connect you guys, and you could see if there was some way of using it." I mean, at that point in time, rock music was just getting its foot into the motion picture business. I mean, now you can't see anything without there being a rock song that's the subtext of whatever is happening on the screen. It's like unbelievable. You couldn't make a movie anymore unless you had a rock song in it. Whereas at that point in time, let's see, yeah, I mean, Mrs. Robinson, the Simon and Garfunkel song was so brilliant in that movie. And when I was working at Columbia, which that's something I'll read about maybe, um, my boss came down the hall one morning and said, "Jim, finally I've got a film I think you'll like." Okay. So we troop up to the 11th floor screening room, and they thread it all onto the machines, and it goes. And it's the Birds singing, and it's Easy Rider, and I'm about to lose my mind that I can't get up and dance because, I wore a three-piece suit and tie and the whole 9 yards. It was, I mean, that's so. If had I had the presence of mind to go up to Warren and say, "Hello, da, 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 I'm so sorry," maybe there's a way that we could make this work. But so I think that's probably, I hope I would have said to him, but I didn't say anything. Well, great. Thank you guys so much for being here, and have a lovely evening. What? Leslie Caron. Yeah.